Oh, hello, and welcome to our second in our talk sessions on Digital Also's Saturday. And this traditionally is the area of the festival where we do have our really big talks from excellent speakers. And we're in great hands today with Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter. I'm sure many of you have been to Salon London or Salon North, which are two Salon style live events that we do with authors and experts and authors and experts and academics to try and get to grips with their ideas. If you've been to any of those, I'm sure you will know David Spiegelhalter. We've worked with him for since the beginning, really. We absolutely love his work, and we're so grateful for him to being part of our first ever digital festival. And we do believe that we are the first summer festival to deliver everything digitally. Have you caught up with the cabaret from last night yet? So let me tell you about how this is going to work. David's going to be talking for about half an hour, and then we're going to be coming back to a question session. You'll see that Dickon, our head of tech for Also Festival, has built this lovely comments field where you can put your questions in there all the way through. You don't need to wait, and then I'll collate them and put them to David in the second half of the talk, which is going to be the second half an hour. This session is for an hour. I have to say, one of the whole points of Also in Salon is that we are able to get put our questions to really brilliant communicators, really brilliant scientists, and you are don't feel that you have to have a PhD in numbers in order to put your question there. This is a great chance to talk to David. He actually holds the Winton Chair for the Public Understanding of Risk, so he wants to hear from your questions. He's also, I noted, described by Andy on Goodreads and also the Financial Times as the world's most famous statistician. He's also the author of The Art of Statistics, the most phenomenal book on how to understand numbers and data. Actually won Salon London's Transmission Prize earlier this year. And we had the Transmission Prize ceremony at the beginning of March, and we weren't touching because it was just beginning to get into pandemic, but we were fist bumping. Even that just seems like a dream. Being in a room with people, being able to touch their elbows and have a drink together seems incredible. Anyway, back to David. He is, as I said, a professor at Cambridge University for the Public Understanding of Risk. He's right here behind me. I've got a quick question for you before we start, David. Hello, David, by the way.
Hello.
Hello. I've got a quick question for you. So, you hold the Winton Chair for the Public Understanding of Risk at Cambridge University.
Well, actually, strictly speaking, not anymore. Formally, I've retired. There isn't one at the moment. There's a bit of a gap. But I'm oh dear, I've got this title. I'm the chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication.
Oh,
what about that?
what a fantastic!
Cool. Cool title, yeah. I still do the same stuff.
Okay. Well, it's been quite a month for you. I think everyone has, if you've listened to the radio, if you watched the TV, we've all got very accustomed to your face, David. And I just wondered, as your job has been to help the public understand risk, do you wish there was a chair for the public to understand the relationship between government and scientists?
Yeah, no, it is. We'll come on to that, I'm sure, with other questions. But it is. Let's say that this is a challenging time for the science policy relationship.
And I think I can already see some questions coming through for that. We're going to hear from David for about half an hour. He's going to be talking. So we're going to be hearing from David for about half an hour. He's going to be talking about some of the data in his book, How to Read Statistics. And then he's going to be talking about COVID. And then we will come back for our questions. So take it away, Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter.
So first of all, it's a real pleasure to be at a Salon event again. And such a shame it's not in person because, as I was saying to Helen earlier, one of the huge joys about the Salon events is interacting with the audience. Always a very lively audience. You have to shut them up. So let me talk, and they're just coming at you all the time with questions. And that lovely interaction is I miss it so much because of being able to be energized by the audience. So we're going to do our best. I'm going to do how I do it, in real life. I'm going to talk about half an hour and then do a conversation. And as Helen said, I'm going to talk a bit about my book because, I got to plug my book, of course, and then talk a bit about COVID stuff. But they are related, and they're related in particular. The sort of narrative behind this is almost a detective story. It's how to try to use data to try to understand things better. And it's not using fancy stats. It's purely just looking at data and trying to choose perhaps the right graph that can bring out some of the lessons. So, okay, so I'm going to try, let's see if this works. I'm going to share my screen because I am going to give, a bit of a talk. So if you forgive me while I mess around with my computer screen. First of all, where's my slides? I've lost it. Oh, there they are. Right, okay. So let's see what I can do here. Sorry for the amateur presentation, but I can do that. Okay, so that's my plug. Art of Statistics, my book. That's me. I'm chair of the Winton Centre, etc., etc. That's the book. It's very good, very good. Highly recommend it. Okay. Now the crucial thing that runs through the book is that data does not speak for itself. Here's a nice quote I have got at the beginning from Nate Silver, author of The Signal and the Noise. Extremely good book on stats. The numbers have no way of speaking for themselves. We speak for them. We imbue them with meaning, and that is I think, really summarizes what I feel about the huge rise in data science and the attention to data now, which is such an exciting and brilliant innovation. And we can see it so much going on at the moment in this crisis. But there is a warning that the data just doesn't tell you its secrets. You have to use judgment and skill and an art in order to extract the real knowledge from that data. So that's my point. Okay, so I teach statistics. The book is actually it's a first course in statistics, all the way through to hypothesis tests and p-values and all that stuff. And but it's disguised as a series of kind of stories of narratives and examples. But it actually does cover all the material, and it's supposed to really show what is a new approach to stats education. If you were all there, I'd ask you, in front of me, I'd ask who's done stats courses, and a lot of people put up their hands, and then I'd ask who actually enjoyed their stats course, and all the hands would go down. And his point is that the way stats has been taught in the past has been pretty dire. A lot of formulae and tests, and probability theory and the sampling distribution of the sample mean and all that kind of stuff. I've taught that. That's what I've done. I've done it all my career. But it's changing. It's changing now to much more to do with sort of data literacy, data science, stats as problem solving. The problem, the question driving the whole process, and as part of this data cycle. And I use an example. New Zealand is the world leader in stats education for reasons that actually are still quite unclear to me, but they are, both in schools and in universities. And this is the nice image they've got for schools, statistics education, with data detective. And that's why the detective idea is it's going to run through my narrative, as I said. And basically this says that, you've got a problem. You start with a question. What's the question? And then you need to plan what to do. You need to design your experiment where, say you're testing. The question might be, how many people in this country have had COVID? Okay, something we don't know. It's a simple thing like that. Don't know. So what sort of plan might you have? You want to do some sort of survey. We don't know. How are we going to go out and test people? How are we going to get them? We don't just get them to, we don't advertise on Facebook like some American studies did. That is not a good plan. And then we have to collect the data, and we manage it, and we do nice things with it. And then we get to the analysis. And a lot of that might be initial data visualization, which I'm going to concentrate on. And then there's this little corner, which is actual sort of formal statistical methods, the fancy stuff, the t-tests, the p-values, all that kind of stuff, which is only a small bit. But that tends to be what everything usually focuses on. And then you get to the final bit, which I think is absolutely vital, which is this communication, the conclusions, the new ideas, and then it all starts again. And it's such a simple idea, but so powerful, and it puts the sort of the stuff that usually puts people off in its context. Okay, so ideas are motivated by questions. So in the book, I talk about how many sexual partners have people had, a very important question. Is it worth me taking statins? And I conclude that it is, and I've just had mine. Who is the luckiest person on the Titanic? I like this one. What's the probability that the skeleton in the Leicester car park really was Richard III? And why do old men have big ears? So these really important questions that are vital to today's society. So I go through all those. Okay, I'd just like to start with a story. I'm afraid I realise, oh God, both my examples today are about deaths. I'm really sorry. And the other thing I should say is that I'm a statistician. It can sound very inhuman the way I talk about body counting deaths and do graphs and things like that. And I should just add, I'm not going to keep on saying, oh, terribly sad and tragic and things like that. I know it is. I've had friends who've died from COVID. I know people who've been seriously ill. I've had, a lot of, death in my family. So, please forgive me for sounding sometimes a little bit just counting the bodies. But that's actually how, please forgive me for that. Okay, so Harold Shipman was a fantastic example of what you might call forensic statistics, when you're trying to use the statistics to understand what went on, in this case, in a crime. Now, if you don't remember, if you're too young, Harold Shipman was this is 20 years ago, general practitioner there. He was arrested. I've got nothing to hide. He did have a lot to hide. Actually lived in Hyde. And every one of those dots is someone he killed, and in a small area. So he steadily worked through his older people on his list. He killed at least 215, probably 45 more. His surgery was about here. People who know the story of John Snow's Broad Street pump might get the feeling of, if you just saw those dots, you might be able to work out where he worked. We were involved as statisticians in the public inquiry into these murders, and that involved looking at the data. And extraordinary, you can still find this data, which I've extracted for the website for the book, looking at all the individuals. So this is just 2 weeks at the beginning of 1998, just 2 weeks. These are all the deaths on his list, all his patients. And over a few weeks, you could see that there were some convictions, unlawful killings, 1 or 2 natural deaths, a few natural deaths, but mainly these were people that he murdered. And you look at their age. And every one of these has got a story. You can click on these and find a story of every one of these, what happened to them. It is appalling narratives. Okay, so here's some data. This is a plot just looking at the little scatter plot, the age of his victims, the year in which he killed them, and the little histogram showing the distribution. And we can get a lot of information here. There's essentially 3 variables, and whether they were men or women, 3 variables being shown there. We can see there were, and if you were all here, I'd be asking questions. I'd be getting you to respond. So just think what you'd respond. I would ask, are there more men than women? No, there's more women than men being murdered. How old are they? They tend to be very old. Was there a change in the pattern? Well, he did start off just with older women, but started then going younger, even some in their 40s later on. What happened here? Everyone says points to this gap, and I asked why, and he didn't go on holiday. He actually felt that he was being suspected here. We think that felt he's being suspected here because all this time he was working in a joint general practice with other people, and here he set up on his own in general practice. And that allowed him complete freedom. And by the time he was arrested, he was murdering many people. Okay, so that's so what was the pattern? Can we get more detail from what was going on? Okay, so that's the problem. The plan then is to actually go into the data and look at the actual records for when his patients died. I didn't do this. It was another professor of general practice went. It's a massive exercise. Went through all his death certificates, and not only his death certificates, but all the ones of his colleagues as well, to see when their patients were dying. And what they managed to do then was just to look at, for his colleagues, other GPs in the area, when did their patients die on the death certificate? And we see a uniform distribution. People don't tend to die at any time of the day or night. But when you look at Shipman's patients, that's the distribution. I think it's one of the most shocking graphs I've ever seen. And you wouldn't know unless you'd thought to go and look at the data. Nobody had looked at it. You had a big amount of work to get the data out. But just to have that imagination, let's look at the times of day at which they died, and you immediately see this huge spike at about between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. And I'd ask, why is that? And you would reply, somebody would reply very quickly, home visits. that he went out after lunch to visit patients in the home when they're on their own. And he said, I'd give you something to relieve your discomfort or pain. And he'd give them a huge dose of diamorphine, and they would die very peacefully and calmly in front of him. And then he would go and forge the medical record to suggest they die of natural causes. One post-mortem would have got him. And nobody did until they finally exhumed 15 of the bodies and found these huge doses, levels of morphine in their bodies. So again, just asking the right question, collecting the right data, and doing a simple visualization gives you this enormous information. The other thing we were asked is, could he have been caught earlier? And that's why our statistical expertise was so important. And the families really wanted to know this. And so again, we didn't collect the data, someone else collected the data, looking at every year how many deaths occurred in his patients, not whether he killed them, just counting how many deaths he had occurred and how many would have been expected to observe were he a normal GP. This is known, technical term, this is known as the null hypothesis. This is, if everything were normal, everything standard, how many, some of his patients would die, how many would be expected to die? Now, that's not a whole number, it'd be like 2.3 or something like that, based on the age and sex of his list and the rates surrounding him and things like that. So we can calculate that, and we can compare then the expected number, because some people always die, with the observed number, and you get the excess mortality. And we're going to come back to excess mortality when we come to COVID. And when you look at his excess mortality, you see it creeping up like that over 20 years. Starts low. This is for women over 65, men over 65, creeping up like that. Now, this data could have been collected by anybody. This is just counting the death records. There's no investigation. There's nothing personal. You don't know anything about these people. It's purely counting the records, which we're going to see in a moment, applying to COVID. Now, the crucial thing from whistleblowing is, when would you say, whoa, this is getting too high? Down here? Where, at what point would you say this is getting too high? Clearly by here, you feel this is getting very high. And you don't want to do that too soon. And I'm not going to go into the statistical details. You have to read the book. But there are statistical techniques that were developed actually in the Second World War for doing this kind of sequential monitoring for industrial processes. And the Shipman inquiry, I think, was the first time one of the first times these industrial, essentially sequential sampling schemes that had been developed for production lines in the war got adapted to medical examples. We had to adapt them specially. And I'm not going to go into the details, but basically we suggested that if in 1985, anybody looking at this data, being very cautious, would have blown the whistle after only 40 years, saying this is completely implausible, this could happen by chance alone, even allowing for the fact that there's 26,000 GPs in the country or something like that. So, because you don't want to you don't want to falsely accuse. So we said that, yep, he could have been caught. We also said that nobody was looking at the data, or the judge said nobody was looking at the data, and so actually nobody was to blame. And so actually that's what the families had to be content with, unfortunately. That nobody was found to be blamed for this because nobody was looking at it. What they did find is, when they tried this method out on general practice records around the country, they found a number of GPs with worse records than Shipman. And when they looked at them, they found out, for example, I think one was working in Eastbourne, down in a retirement community, many elderly people, quite a high death rate among older people. And he was extremely good and caring GP who managed to keep his patients out of hospitals, kept them in the care homes and at home. And so he was signing a huge number of death certificates. So it would have been appalling if he had been identified by some automatic system. So again, what that shows is the real limitations of statistics. It can identify interesting signals. It can identify outliers. It cannot say why they are happening. And we're going to see that for the COVID as well. Okay, let's move. Let's move over to the virus panic. This was back in March, February the 28th. This was when it all just started, this business. So it did start. Remember how long ago this started? As Helen said, I was at an event, I think it was March the 4th. We were starting to bump elbows. I did a news night that evening, the first of the COVID media events, and in which we didn't shake hands, which slightly surprised the people in the studio. And but actually, who knew? We didn't realize quite what was going to happen. Okay, and this was the sort of headline that was appearing: could kill 500,000 Britons, etc., etc. Rather, panic-stricken headlines. Of course, we have seen, things are really bad, have got really bad. So let's look. Oh, that was my idiotic picture of me with, I should say, used face masks. So I wasn't wasting face masks at this point, of showing my attitude to risk about all these things, or some people's attitudes to risk. Okay, so just to show some bad examples, new cases per day. I just wondered if this was a graph that was shown from Fox News. Just look at the y-axis, look at the numbers on the y-axis. I've never seen a graph that's quite been labeled like that. It's really, really bizarre. So it shows we do have to check on the sort of statistics we're hearing all the time. The statistics I'm going to report, I think, are extremely reliable, extremely good. Okay, let's look at some numbers. Let's try to do some of that Shipman stuff, some of this, exploration, some of this detective work. These are the deaths. This is data from Tuesday. So this was just released on Tuesday. So these are registered deaths in England and Wales since the beginning of the winter. This is the 5-year average going along here. And the red are the COVID deaths. So registered. It's not the date of the actual death, it's the date of the registration. What we can see is that actually the winter before Christmas, there was slightly above average, but after Christmas, it's been a very mild winter, and there'd been actually very little circulating seasonal flu. So we're actually been doing up to here, we were doing very well, about essentially 5,000 deaths sort of in credit, people you would have expected to die who didn't die, which does mean there was a pool of vulnerable elderly people. Then the epidemic started, and we see these massive spikes, which is now coming down. I mean, this is slightly delayed because it's registrations. If we knew the actual data, it would be coming down even steeper. So what we see here, though, is this spike of red COVID cases. But this is the interesting thing, I think. This shows the excess deaths over those we'd expect normally that are not being labeled as COVID. Okay, so let's remember that. So that's about 25% of all the excess deaths are not being labeled as COVID. And that's, I think, quite important. In Italy, only half the excess deaths are being labeled as COVID. It's quite extraordinary how many extra deaths are occurring. So, okay, so let's actually look at the excess. So this is subtracting away the 5-year average. We can see this slightly above before Christmas, below before Christmas, and then the spike. And again, here we got the 25%, about 8,000 excess deaths. That was just in this last week. There were about 8,000 extra and about 2,000 not COVID. But it's about 25-30% not being labeled as COVID. So who are they? So let's look in more detail. Let's do the drilling down. Let's do the Shipman approach. So let's start looking at over the last 5 weeks at the peak of the epidemic for women and for men, for the different age groups. The black is how many people you'd have expected to die. This is how many people actually died. The red is the COVID. And the gap between here, there, and there are the excess non-COVID deaths. And we can see those occurring in the older age groups. This grey line, these excess non-COVID deaths. And we can see the very steep rise in the risk of dying. We know it goes up massively with age. The problem is with this picture is that it really obscures what's going on down here. You can't see at all what's going on down here. Bad plot for that. Let's dig down. Let's look at just the under 45s, the younger people. What's happening there? Now, what we see here is that there are some COVID deaths, not many, not very many. You look at the scale now, we're in hundreds here. There are some non-COVID COVID deaths. Under 15s, there's two so far. There may be more because of coroner's reports coming in, but that's in this group here, up to 15 years old. There's 10 million people in this group, and for 2 deaths so far. But generally, the line, you see the black line goes through here. There's not good evidence. There's no, in this group, they're not, and here this follows amazingly well. They're not an excess of non-COVID deaths. There are some COVID deaths, and those are the extras. The fascinating thing, which I spotted yesterday, I don't think anyone spotted this yet, You can only do it. Look at this gap here. Look at this gap here. Now, what is that? Young men aged 20 to 24. Now, usually, I can see, if you can see here, there's always a spike here. There's always a bump. This is the bump of risk-taking young men. This is a very sad bump, and it's there in all mortality statistics in all countries. Not for women in particular, but for risk-taking young men, usually around about early 20s. This is, I'm afraid, this is accidents, this is road accidents. This is, getting drunk and some drug things, but a lot of them just accidental deaths. And there's been a 35% reduction in all-cause deaths in that group. If you take out the COVID deaths, there's a 45, nearly a halving in deaths in that group. So we could say that the lockdown has perhaps some benefits, at least in that small group. And again, that's just by looking at that. Nothing fancy analysis. It is statistically significant, but we needn't bother with that. Okay, let's look. The final bit of mystery I want to talk about is care homes, which people are interested in. So what this is doing is taking the same graph, looking at total deaths in care homes and at home and in hospitals. Let's look at hospitals. We can see here big rise in COVID deaths in hospitals. But what's happened to the non-COVID deaths? They've dropped. And this is because the NHS hasn't exactly shut up shop, but it sent all its patients home who could be sent home, and it's closed its routine care, and A&E attendances have halved. People are not going to A&E. They're not going to A&E. They're not calling the ambulance. They're not, they're not. There's huge reduction in other admissions to hospital and a huge reduction in deaths. So you could say, so that's happened. In care homes, obviously, we've got a rise in COVID deaths, but look at the massive number of non-COVID deaths in care homes. And at home, huge rise in non-COVID deaths at home. So, and this looks at this in slightly more detail. So essentially what we've done is there's 20,000 extra non-COVID deaths in homes and care homes, all this lot. 6,000 of them have been exported from hospital, but that leaves 14,000 essentially extra deaths in the community, not being labeled as COVID. It is the big mystery. Everyone's got ideas that, actually they are COVID and it's not being put on certificate. Well, I'm not convinced about that. That is the current mystery. Because how many of those are due to the disruption in the health service? I would say a large number. Okay, this data came out yesterday, again showing much more detailed data on care home deaths, whether people died in the care home or in the hospital, showing again a real peak around here in care home, people living in care homes in mid-April, and then dropping down really quite steeply, which is obviously a good thing, but showing also these are all the non-COVID deaths happening to COVID care home residents. Big lump there. Oh, this is a very complicated graph. Basically, it shows this is all deaths from COVID in the country, in England, just in England, this one. Peak on April the 8th, a clear peak on April the 8th, steady decline. This is in hospitals, clear peak on April the 8th. In care homes, the red line, more peak around 70th, about a week later, and then a slower decline, but much slower decline than in hospitals, and suggesting these have crossed now. The dashed line is CQC data, which is based on just reports, very erratic, big weekend effects and so on. Because there's always, the nice solid lines are completely reliable, but they are delayed because they're based on death registrations. So the data comes in from this is data from 3 different sources, 3 different websites, all put together, and it's complicated. It's a bit of a mess. It's a detective work. Okay, so just to wrap up now, people ask me all the time, because I'm supposed to do risk, what's the risk of COVID? What's the risk of dying from COVID? And the first thing I say is, what do you mean? What do you mean? Please be clear. I think it's a really bad phrase to use. When you hear it in the media, what does it mean? Does it mean the risk when you haven't got the disease of getting the virus and then dying? In other words, that's called the population fatality rate, the risk for all of us who haven't got, well, we hope haven't got it, or the risk if you get it. Now, these are completely different things. Very different factors might come into it. This, for example, the risk, we know that ethnicity is a powerful factor here to increase the death rates among ethnic minorities is there. But how much of that is the risk of actually getting it compared with the risk if you get it? and so on. So it must be very clear. If we look at the population fatality rate, okay, sorry, you're getting lots of numbers here, but you asked for it. You didn't ask for it, but you're getting it anyway. Populate. So this is this is amazing. This is the most amazing graph, I think. So this is just in all these different age groups for men and women. What fraction of 100,000 people have died from COVID? Died with COVID on their death certificate? And these are just, this isn't smooth. This is amazing straight line. Look at that on a logarithmic scale, meaning that the risks go up completely exponentially. It is quite extraordinary. This virus does not like age. Every year, older increases your risk by 11 to 12%. It doubles every 6 to 7 years. That means it goes up by 8 times every 20 years or something. It means that an 80-year-old has got 500 times the risk of a 20-year-old, and so on. It's quite extraordinary how steep the effect of age is. Very difficult to communicate this idea. Men having twice the risk of women. Now that's just using the data. Ethnicity would affect that. Lots of other things would affect that. But those are the bald data. So here's just some crude data. Average age of average woman who dies of COVID is 84, about the same as normal. Man is 81. This is really, the deaths are in the older age group. Very few under 25, 1 in 1,000. And very few under 45, really, about 1 to 2%, less than the normal proportion of deaths that are under 45. Very steep increase with age, really steep increase with age. So, okay, I've written this out as prompts for me. This is what I would say. So just, okay, quick, going through. During the 5 weeks of the peak epidemic, 1 in 1,800 of the population has died. Whoops. But that is a terrible summary, because that's not a risk that applies to almost anybody. Almost everybody was at higher risk of that or lower risk of that. Very few people roughly had that risk. This is the risk of both getting the virus and dying from it. It's higher for men, for ethnic minorities, and some occupations. It's higher for taxi and bus drivers, care home workers, not higher for doctors and nurses, which is very interesting. Staggeringly low risk for the under 15s, 2 deaths out of greater than 10 million. Staggeringly high risk for the over 90s. Over 1% of the over 90s died with COVID over those 5 weeks. It's about 10,000 times the risk of young people. This is, I've been trying to work out ways to communicate this huge range in risk. And one way to say it is that for people above 45, their risk over that 5 weeks was increased by about 2/3, or roughly about, instead of 5 weeks of risk, they had 8 weeks of risk. For everybody, no matter how old you were, it just pumped up your background risk, much less for younger people. If you're infected, it looks like for me that if you get infected, you essentially have got about 6 to 9 months of normal risk that you're packing into a few weeks. So this is something that I do like as a comparator, is what is always compare with the risks we face all the time. Life doesn't go on forever. We all face risks. These are the risks of dying each year for males and females in this country. Again, this is the hump we've seen for young men, a little bit for young women. This is the risk for primary school kids, less than 1 in 10,000. Nobody has ever been as safe in the whole history of humanity anywhere ever as primary school kids are in this country today. So this is, this means that it makes risk comparisons quite tricky. Okay, that's the data that was used in March from Imperial College. I'm not going to show. Basically, what it said is that the risks, if you get COVID, that they estimated in March were the black dots. And I just did this in March and plotted and realized, my goodness, they're going very closely along to your annual risk. So the risks that they claim then, which may have, it looks like they've dropped a little bit, but not a huge amount, but they have dropped. I think people would say it's a bit lower. Roughly speaking, it was a risk of, if you get COVID, of dying. It was about the same as your annual risk of dying anyway. And now I think it may be more like 9 months of risk or something like that. So I thought that was a really clear graph, a really good, easy expression. Unfortunately, this has been a total disaster in communication. Katie Hopkins, with her million followers, the BBC drew this graph, gave me credit, very nice of them, good of them to do that. To deaths are not outpacing what is normal or usual. So to 1 million followers, saying that because these dots follow this, oh, there's no increased risk from coronavirus. No. The fact that the risks of coronavirus are roughly the same as your annual risk does not mean they're the same thing. If I've got an apple and you got an apple, we've got two apples. Even if they're the same, they're not the same actual apple. They're just the same, quantity. So, oh my God. And headline in the Sun: your risk of dying is no different this year despite coronavirus. Says expert. Me. I didn't say that. Total disaster. That was just earlier, a few days ago. I complained and they changed it. That's better. But I wanted to, again, it doesn't really, it's in addition to your, please, it adds it. I know. So I've made a disaster in communicating. Now, at least the BBC do say it roughly doubles your risk. But, it's just shown me the real difficulty in communicating in this context. So just to finish off, trustworthy communication. You should be informing and not persuading. And I'm going to talk about trustworthy communication because I want to come down to this important. You've got to be open. You've got to make your data accessible, intelligible, usable, accessible. And these are good phrases, I think, that is good. People should be able to check your working if they want to. You've got to be admit uncertainty. You've got to respect audiences and test outputs. You should use multiple ways to communicate. I like this idea of star rating qualitative evidence. We could talk about that later. You've got to vigorously preempt misunderstandings. And I fail in that all the time. I always never quite grasp how much things will be misunderstood. And I think you've got to work with communications and professionals and psychologists. So I just want to show my little rant. You may have seen this on television, but I would like to show my little rant about I think I should be able to show this. Let's go then full screen. This, what I call number theatre. Oh, hang on. No, I want to go back to the beginning. Which seems to be. No, hang on. I want to go back to the beginning. I haven't done the end. Okay, hang on. Here we go. There's only 1 minute. Really much more by. No. Stop.
They're now very familiar with these daily press briefings. How well are they working, do you think?
Well, I watched yesterday's, and frankly, I found it completely embarrassing. We get told lots of big numbers, imprecise numbers of tests being done, 96,878. Well, that's not how many were done yesterday. It includes people that were posted out, tests that were posted out. We're told 31,587 people have died. No, they haven't. It's far more than that. So I think this is, actually not a trustworthy communication of statistics. And it's such a missed opportunity. There's a public out there who are broadly very supportive of the measures. They're hungry for details, for facts, for genuine information. And yet they get fed this, what I call number theatre. Which seems to be coordinated really much more by, a number 10 communications team rather than genuinely trying to inform people about what's going on. I just wish that the data was being brought together and presented by people who really knew its strengths and limitations and could treat the audience with some respect.
They're now very familiar with these daily press.
Yeah, I'll stop now. So that was my rant, which summarised what I felt. Okay, I'll shut up now. Sorry, I don't know how long I've gone on.
Oh,
that's not too
bad. No, that's perfect. And thanks so much, David. And thanks for talking us through the art of statistics. And think since I saw you in March, I just don't think any of us could predicted how much we now have learned about logarithmic graphs, reading data,
scale. Yeah.
And I think, as you said later on in that interview, we are all hungry to understand how to read the data.
Yeah.
And, in your book, actually, which you wrote, much before this, you talk about, in the final chapter, you talk about, the three people who really need to understand data. And one of those is audiences. We do have a responsibility. And
I really feel at this time people are making such sacrifices in so many ways that they have absolutely earned the right to be treated as adults, to be given in good information that is not trying to manipulate them and that is fair and balanced and admits its limitations, which it inevitably has.
I wanted to ask one question about that, and that's obviously, you know, over your career, you've seen the rise of many things, but also social media. And in terms of that audience, you know, what difference has social media made in terms of the public understanding of risk?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I like social media. Well, I suppose I like some bits. I just use Twitter. That's all I use. But I blog as well. And I have found it extremely exciting because it gives, I mean, I am, in a sense, a communicator. I do it. But I hear back messages all the time, you know, and so I find out what's being misunderstood, which you don't know otherwise. So oh my God, how could they think that? And I realized this is my failure because I didn't test the messages to find out what was being misunderstood. And yet I'm learning all the time by receiving. And then of course you get people saying nice things. And then you get people giving, I mean, I get sent endless analyses and stuff like that. And people make comments on Twitter. There's some really good, what I might call, you know, amateur statisticians out there, you know, who've got time and there's all this data available. They're doing stuff. I've had idea after idea after idea from people who are just doing it and then saying, what about this? And contributing back and feeding back. So I'm finding, you know, as I said, I use Twitter all the time in both ways, and has been an extraordinarily strong and positive resource. And I don't even get much abuse either, which is nice. I mean, I don't read it. I just block it. Don't take any notice. So, but it's been a fantastic resource in this domain. Again, because I do feel, because of the sacrifice that everybody is making, the citizens have an absolute right to contribute to the discussion and to be treated, as said, with respect and as adults.
And I suppose, yeah, okay, let's go. There's so many places that we can go to that. But do you think one of the ways that you can make this easier to understand is, as you said, have this star rating of quality of evidence?
Yeah, I do feel that. I mean, that's why when in my little diatribe, I did say very strongly about the strengths and the limitations of evidence. You know, a lot of the things we don't know. You know, we have a lot of uncertainty, and the evidence often is not very good. We got to admit that. And I like this idea. In health, there is a star rating system. It's called GRADE, in which you can give evidence that's based on fantastic, you know, randomized trials and give it a 4-star rating, and then down to and 1 star and 2 star. But if you're looking at, say, the evidence for the effectiveness of wearing a face mask at transmission thing, 1, possibly 2 stars if you're really, you know, being generous. And a lot of the evidence is of that level. So you could make an estimate, but actually you just don't know. And a lot of, and that would be about a lot of this this virus. Obviously, evidence is gaining quality all the time. But if you look at the evidence for how many people have had the virus in the country, my God, we're still arguing about whether it's 5 million or 25 million. You know, this is, you know, because the evidence has been so weak so far. It's getting better. It will get better when we start doing proper surveys. But it is extraordinary. And I think openness and transparency. And I must say, some of the people performing, you know, I think the Valence and Whitty have been good about admitting things, you know, that we don't know everything. We're essentially learning as we go along and so on.
It's really fascinating, and I sort of blow my mind a bit about this idea that you actually, you know, can learn and refine so quickly with social media that is helpful to academics. I've actually got an academic here, Professor Catherine Loveday, who's saying, lovely talk, and she says, you know, agree, us scientists need to be open and clear about uncertainty. But she's saying, in her experience, the media hate uncertainty, and they want to relentlessly push for a clear and unambiguous message.
Yeah, I have thought that, and some can be like that, but I don't think. I think with care, you can communicate uncertainty, and I mean, of course, you can't say, "Whoa, your guess is as good as mine," and that's not what uncertainty is. Uncertainty is saying what we do know, but also what we don't know, and what we're doing about it, and how we're going to try to learn about it. And my experience, and we're actually in our centre been doing research on the public, showing that you can admit uncertainty without losing trust and credibility. So I think. Actually, I feel that a lot of scientists I know will say, "Oh, we can't admit uncertainty, blah blah blah. Nobody will take any notice of this, and the media will just, you know, everybody wants to be certain." I think just try, but think about it, and, you know, hone the message and test the message, I think we can be a lot more open about what we don't know and still keep trust and credibility and even be well reported. Oh, we know, there will be distorted. I mean, look at the stuff that I've had, we know that things will be distorted and misunderstood. But if you understand the misunderstandings, you can, I think, preempt them.
Yeah, and I think very good academics do, and I think Catherine would say that she does do that, but it can be unusual. It can be overwhelming. And would you have said to the government to take that advice as well in terms of their communication over risk and data, that perhaps they could have taken that advice of telling people what they know and what they don't know? Would you advise it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I must say, I got no, influence on anything apart from moaning on Andrew Marr, which is great. But no, I always go back to John Krebs, who was head of the Food Standards Agency through multiple public disasters, foot and mouth, BSE, and all this sort of stuff. And he had a very clear list of how he approached this thing. In crisis communication, you do tell people what you know. And then you immediately tell people what you don't know. And you admit it, you own up to it. And then you say what you're doing about it. And then you say them what they can do about it in the meantime. And that could be precautionary because you don't know everything. And then you say things will change and I'll come back to you. And when at the start of this, I was very positive about the communication. I think that Whitty and Balance and everything had a prominent role and they were doing it very well. Since then, these briefings have turned into have been stage managed as much more as to protect the government, I feel, and I've lost confidence in it. So, and I strongly would feel now that they ought to, the science part of the briefing should be split off and not be under the control of, not of any politicians, no ministers present there, just be delivered by head of the statistical service, head of PHE, and so on. And that's it.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I missed the last bit of that. You're saying you think that the science part of the briefing should be split off?
It should be split off, a separate issue with no political contribution whatsoever.
Yeah, when I said at the beginning of it, do you wish there was a public chair for the understanding of the way science and government work? I wasn't really joking. I think one of the things people really understood is it's not an easy relationship.
No.
Yeah.
And many people are talking about that and how it works and the degree to which one can be open and transparent and things like that. And there's a lot of discussion about that. And people speaking openly, as I would as well, about this immense irritation when these are political decisions. The actual decisions being made are made by politicians, and that's clear. Obviously, there is a scientific contribution, but these are not driven by the science. The science says. The science never says anything. It gives some uncertain idea of what might happen if you do X. In the end, these are political decisions, and I think there's a reasonable fear among the science community that they're going to get all the blame, because there's going to be a lot of blame after this. Already there is, but there's going to be quite a lot afterwards.
Oh, we've had a couple of thanks. Sharon Graham. Hello, Sharon. Thank you for denouncing the government theatre, as the number theatre, as you call it, in the Government Daily's briefing. And Catherine Van Salus as well. Thank you so much. Matt, I might come back to your question in a minute. There is a question from Natalie here that I think is quite a big question, and I wanted to put it to you. And that's this idea of, okay, so what is a stat that's most likely to reassure a majority of people that it's safe enough to begin to re-engage in their pre-pandemic lifestyle?
One of the problems with this is that whatever you say, somebody will say either, oh, you're trying to reassure people, or that you're trying to frighten people. I'm not trying to do either. Just trying to tell it how it is. The point about this virus, as Whitty has said right from the beginning, is that actually for younger, healthier people, it is it really, really is low risk. And that's why I have been pushing this idea of, out of under 15 so far, there's been 2 deaths. Now, there may have been more, waiting for some, I'm sure there's some coroner's reports going, coroner's delays on this, but it's still going to be extremely low risk for school kids to themselves. And even for young, up to 25, 30 and things like that, very low risk, even higher. Compared with normal risk, it's a fraction of the normal risk that people are exposed to in their lives, tiny fraction. So that's I think it's very important. For older people, it's really dangerous. It really, really is. This is a nasty thing, a nasty disease, and this is dangerous. And for people in between, it can be dangerous as well. For middle-aged people, people with diabetes, people with overweight, and this can be a very nasty disease. The syndrome, It's not so much the initial thing, but the inflammatory syndrome you get after. It's going to be very nasty. So what I'm saying, I'm not trying to reassure anybody. I'm not trying to frighten anybody. It's both. This is, as I said, it's very difficult to communicate risk when there's a 10,000-fold difference between one group and another group in terms of the risk. This is, I don't know anything. Even normal life doesn't have that range of risk associated with it. So this is a tricky business. And I think, schools reopen. In the end, you can quote numbers till you're blue in the face, but I think in the end, it's going to be based on experience and social norms. And, seeing that in Denmark, there hasn't been primary schools have been open for a month and there hasn't been a big rise. And, I think we need to learn from other communities. One of the things that absolutely amazes me is that all the discussion seems to think that we're operating in some little vacuum. It's just nonsense. We should be looking all the time at what's happening elsewhere and studying them. It's just extraordinary how every country seems to tackle this all on their own, and as if it doesn't exist outside. Just seems mad.
I suppose the way we're organised, reports by country, and so you tend to see the data as country and then presume that kind of it has something more than an arbitrary border for the virus. There's a couple of questions from Marla and from Juliet, which are in the same area, so I'm going to put them both to you at the same time. Both say excellent talk. Thank you. But I think this plays to your point that people really want to understand. They want to know, how do I read this data? And this question is, how can we better understand the data? There is so much information, so many statistics out there. Who and what do we believe, and how do we personally get more savvy about getting closer to a fuller picture?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I really feel it upsets me. That's why you had this little rant on Andrew Marr. I'm not going to do it again. I've got it off my chest. Now I'm going to try to do something about it and help people to get better data. Well, there is fantastic data. The Office for National Statistics is doing a brilliant job, and PHE now has got its act together. I think introducing good statistics. They've got a good surveillance bulletin. But it's all over the place, and it's not being brought together in a really good way for the public, I don't think. And that's why I just feel that there should be a section, perhaps a daily section. I mean, this opportunity is amazing. There's never been one like it for good science communication, in which you could get people who really know about it to present the data. And with thoughtful graphs, careful graphs, they can talk about them. People who actually understand them and aren't just waving their arms around and quoting cliches, who can understand them. And then and they could go through different topics. So you could have a day on excess deaths, you could have a day on care homes, you could have a day on something else, in which you do really think hard about what would be the best graphics. I do my best, but I fail, as I've shown repeatedly at producing good communications. But there is a skill in this. Communicating numbers there's an art to it. There's a science to it as well, and that's what I'm fascinated by, of checking, of listening, and we're learning a lot about what people can understand, graphical literacy and things like that. So you need that input as well. So you need good designers, but you also need, I think, psychologists to help on this as well. So this is a wonderful opportunity that is being wasted at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, on that failing, I think, you're absolutely right as psychologists. We fail all the time. But the idea is that we refine, we fail, we work out what's wrong, and we refine. It's part of being human. It does lead me on to a question from Danny Dorling, who's actually...
Danny! Hi,
Well, it's a tough question, I have to say.
Oh, no, it would be. I won't answer it. I don't want to answer his question. No. If he was in the audience, I'd say, speak to the hand, Danny.
Well, he's asked two questions, so I'll ask the first one, and then maybe we'll move on.
He would try to get two.
Danny's social geographer at Oxford University. He's up next. But he said, "Can you, David, has this shaken your faith in our political system?"
Oh God.
There you go.
Oh well, I'm not going to make grand claims about the political system. All I'm going to do is to repeat what I have said: is that the process of science relating to policy, and in particular the communication of that, has been done badly, and it's shaken my faith in that. As I said at the beginning, I thought it was being done very well, and it's failed because of what I feel political control of the science communication. And so that's as far as I go. I'm not going to say about the whole system. I mean, I found myself, I've been quoted at PMQs by both Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer in favour of what they were saying. So, I do feel I've been bounced around a bit as a political football, but, so I live and learn, but I'm not going to make grand claims about the political system. But I do think that political, science communication should not be under political control.
Yeah, and and just to say that, from all of us at Salon, David, we work with a lot of academics, a lot of authors, a lot of brilliant people over the course of the year, and a lot of them really end up putting themselves and their ideas really out there, and it isn't pleasant. And we just want to say thank you. You're not doing this for the good of your health. You are trying to communicate messages that are really, really important.
And I'm not being paid.
Well, yeah. Yeah, and
no, actually, though, I'm just fine. I'm fine. I get very little abuse back, and I'm developing a thicker skin. And the thing that upsets me most is when people just misunderstand what I'm saying. But then I realise, it's my failure as much as them.
But you can understand how difficult it is for people who are taking academics who have got less, who are getting abused their ideas.
Yeah, I know, but this also has been, I do a lot of stat stuff, but there's more and more statisticians getting up there and putting their voice being heard. Science Media Centre doing a fantastic job of getting scientists on board. I think one of the real problems of the SAGE system is the sense that it muzzles almost so much of the science community who are involved in this, and you can't directly talk about what's going on there. So it's great all the scientists having this input into government, but it's not good if it then muzzles them and then they can't go out and talk to the media. I think that's very unfortunate. So I think that any team, what it's shown is that teams working in a really important area like this, which is so vital to the public, should make sure that they have a good, one person who is responsible for the communications, who's trained, who's not trying to just put it on top of everything else they're doing. Because I can do this as my job, essentially. I can't. And I think this is absolutely vitally important that what it's shown is that science teams need to take their communications, public communications, so much more seriously.
Okay, that's like an absolutely amazing note to end on, David. I have to just say, David's book, Art of Statistics, is fantastic. Sorry. So I have to say, hello, everyone. Thank you for making that such an incredible session. There's a reason why we've worked with David for nearly a decade now. And we're so grateful to him for giving us his time, because there's no one quite like it when it comes to data and statistics. I totally agree with Andy on Goodreads and also the FT that he is the most incredible statistician. We are selling his book in our book shop. We have a bookshop on our kind of digital festival site.
I can't sign them.
You can't sign them.
Another real lack of not having the audience there. The thing I love best of all is talking afterwards, especially if they buy a book. But, I just love that. And I'm so sorry not to have that.
Well, David, the next iteration of Digital also is going to have that function. Dickon doesn't know that yet. Dickon is one of the founders of also, who's coded absolutely everything so that we can have this incredible platform and time together. But yeah, we're going to find a way of getting you together with your readers. In the meantime, you might want to get hold of the book so you can read it, so you're ready to talk to David next time. You could buy from them, but please buy from us. Buying books is a huge part of Also Festival, and really hope that lockdown is a good chance to read a book. And as David has really made it abundantly clear, if ever we needed to understand the art of statistics, it really is now. So it just remains to say thank you so much for being part of Digital also, David.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to the audience. I'm just sorry I couldn't hug you all. Yeah.
Oh, a big virtual hug and a guide.
Virtual hug.
Virtual hug from David, and an incredible guide to the numbers in COVID. This salon is now closed. Thank you, David.
Okay, thanks so much.
And we'll be seeing you in 15 minutes at 11:15 with Danny Dorling. Thank you so much for being part of this community with David for the Art of Statistics.